Welcome, everybody, to Courageous Conversations. It is my privilege and honor to introduce to you the Reverend Father Ron Rolheiser. He is one of my heroes of the faith. Those of you who hear me preach on a regular basis have probably heard him quoted more than any other theologian, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that. So, Father Ron, welcome. We are so glad that you are a part of this courageous conversation on the topic of suicide. Now, before we get to that, I want the people to know you. I feel like I know you because I've read every one of your books. I read all of your articles, and many of my parishioners are subscribers as well. So thank you for your ministry.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks.
You reach a lot of people, as you know, and we are so thankful to God for you. So, Father Ron, where were you born and raised?
Well, I was actually born on the prairie, so I probably have some affinity to Kansas. I was raised in the Saskatchewan prairies. I'm a Canadian. I'm not sure these names will mean much to people, from about 100 miles west of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is really in the triangle. You've probably heard of Edmonton, Calgary. That's all a big one prairie area. I was raised on a farm there, so I have prairie roots.
And I have been reading that you have been blessed with an incredible family.
Yeah.
And what did they give you in a nutshell? What did they give you that has formed you your whole life?
Well, a number of things. That's a good question, Jeff. In terms of, well, first of all, they gave me the faith, but more than that, my mom and dad, and they gave that to all of us. My dad was probably the most moral man I ever knew. My mom was the most generous woman I ever met. Put that together in a faith-filled family. But they gave us other like human values too. We grew up in a backwoods, but they instilled the idea of education. But maybe most important of all, and that's why I entered the ministry, they instilled the idea your life isn't your own. You're sent here. You don't make decisions for yourself. I mean, the whole thing about God is a call, God is a plan, and that plan usurps your plan. And maybe that's the most powerful religious thing that you walk as a Christian, you walk morally, you walk honestly, but also that your life isn't your own.
Yes.
It's just that there's a call, and you answer a call when it comes.
That's a real powerful gift.
Yeah.
Perhaps you've heard that expression, write your plans in pencil and hand the eraser to God.
Yeah.
So, Father Ron, you are well educated and you received your PhD where?
The University of Louvain in Belgium.
Yes.
And it was a great privilege. I was looking at American universities, and I was trying to get into University of Chicago because I wanted to study with Langdon Gilkey. Remember that theologian?
Yes.
And I was also looking at Yale. And one day, one of my colleagues just said to me, says, if you get a chance to study in Europe for 4 years and don't take it, you're crazy because you're going to spend the rest of your life in America.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the clinching argument, just in a different culture to have kind of a different experience of world and church and so on.
Well, the reason, Father Ron, that I wanted to emphasize that is because every brilliant mind that I have ever known has passed through Louvain.
Okay.
So you come
some
from
unbrilliant ones have also gone through there. So you're looking at them. Okay.
But anyway, I want to compliment you because your scholarship is exemplary, but your pastoral heart is incredibly engaging.
Yeah.
So thank you. Well, let's jump right in, Father Ron. Why are you passionate about this topic of suicide, as evidenced by your writings and your book?
Well, I'll tell you what, that dates back a long ways. And it's a personal thing. Probably the most soul scarring experience I ever had in my life, I had when I was 14 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to do with suicide.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up on a farm. We were very close to our neighbors. And I'm 14, and my only real ambition that summer was to try to make our baseball team, the high school baseball team. When you're 14, that's what's important. And we had a neighbor, this man was probably in his mid-20s, had the body of an athlete, the looks of a movie star, very gentle man, and so on. And one day he hung himself in their barn. And, I was 14. I couldn't process that, either from a human point of view or from a Christian point of view. Remember, we had the idea that's an act of despair. This man's going to go to hell. But it was just my first real experience of death. But it wasn't an old person dying. It was this young, athletic man, whom we realized afterwards had some mental issues, but it just absolutely rocked me. And also seeing people, I was just a kid, but seeing people trying to work through that. That was still a time when, the church had to make a decision. Do you bury this person in a church cemetery? It's just an act of despair and so on. And so that's right. And I think I became a priest because of that. That was just a deep, jarring, but in the end, spiritual experience. But what does life mean? So on. And then I went to the seminary and I kind of blotted a lot of this out and so on. And my very first year ordained, and I was studying in California. And I'd go to this parish and help out on weekends. And one time the pastor was gone. He asked me to take over for a couple of weeks. And sure enough, we had a suicide. And so I'm burying this 34-year-old man, wife and kids, and I thought, I cannot not address this. I just can't go into the pulpit and say, well, God is good and, we believe in life everlasting and he's in a better place. All of that is true. But, somehow that the stigma, the scar, the pain that's left behind of a suicide. And so I did in a my own little inarticulate way. And I just got this massive reaction to reception because nobody ever talks about this. And so once I started writing an article every year. I do just a simple piece and so on. And Jeff, in the last, really 30 years, I don't think a week has gone by where I haven't got a letter, phone call, or an email from a family who lost somebody to suicide. And it's such a painful experience. Share a little something. There's a group in Chicago. I don't know what they're called, some survivors group, and I did they had an interview with me last year and so on. But anyway, they gave me an award for my work with suicide. Now I've had many awards in my life and Book of the Year awards and so on. I think that means more to me than any of the others.
Yeah.
These are really hurt, grieving people.
Yes. Well, and Father Ron, I've experienced it in my family. My father-in-law committed suicide. And as a parish pastor, my second funeral was a suicide.
Yeah.
And the man wasn't even a man of my parish.
Yeah.
But the widow called me and said, would you do my husband's funeral because our pastor won't do the service? Yeah. So those experiences shape us, obviously. But Father,
if you notice, Jeff, that as far as we've come as a society and a church, it still isn't open. Notice you never read an obituary suicide. They say died suddenly, died tragically, or even the last week, the Naomi Judge or whatever her name was, suicide. But it's kind of, they said it, but they won't say it. So there's still a stigma, a societal stigma, not just a spiritual thing, that it's still, our society still really struggles to handle this.
Well, so Father Ron, that leads me to this question, is that a 14-year-old is struggling to process that event.
Yeah.
You had to hold it, if you will, until you had some tools.
Yeah.
Did you start processing that whole experience theologically, psychologically in seminary? Or at what point did you say, I need to reclaim the grief that's in my soul around this issue, this event?
I think it lay dormant. It was a piece, and my father died while I was in the seminary, and he was young. He was 62 and I was 23 or whatever, But that was the first family death. But looking at him in the casket, I thought, this doesn't sting me in the same way as this other thing did 9-10 years ago, and I just realized. But I think it's when I had to begin to deal with other people who lost people to suicide that I began to process this theologically, psychologically, started looking at literature, and just you learn most, not from the psychological literature, you learn most from listening to the stories. It's just,
Yes.
the piece I had to process, and that I could with my theology was, and we can talk about that afterwards, about, God, how God handles suicides, And,
Right. So, Father Ron, you have written an article once a year for how many years?
probably 25 years. And
25 years.
many of them are the same. Sometimes I begin by quoting Margaret Atwood. She says, certain things need to be said and said and said again until they don't need to be said anymore.
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, there's only so many things you can say about it, but they have to be said again and again and again.
So I want to quote you, Father Ron, and because I want you to hear this, please. I have given to many families over my 38 years of ministry your articles. Every time there's a suicide, I copy them off and I give them. You have no idea the consolation that comes to them because of that.
Well,
So
thanks
thank
for
you
sharing that.
again. And in one of those articles, you said, and I quote, "There are many misconceptions to suicide. And we need to take some time to unpack that," you said in this article. And you begin to list the misconceptions. Can you touch on some of those now, Father Ron, please?
Yeah.
What are some of the misconceptions about suicide?
The biggest one is this, is that somehow this person is doing this willfully.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me make a distinction, and I'm going to go into what suicide. Some of the articles, I make a distinction as my own language, where I say I make a distinction between a suicide and somebody who kills himself. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And by killing himself, I mean somebody like Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody like Hitler didn't commit suicide. He killed himself.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is this. A suicide dies because they're too fragile and wounded and bruised to stay alive. Somebody kills themselves, that's an act of arrogance. I'm too proud and strong to be with the human race, See,
Mhm.
So most suicides are that first category. It's not a Hitler. It's not somebody who's like willfully, doing this, and that it's a disease, and it needs to be named that, we understand every year, we understand better physical health, and we're getting to understand mental health a little bit. But the analogy I use in the book is the same way as people can die of heart attack, stroke, of cancer, they
Mhm.
die against their will.
Mhm.
Most suicide victims die against their will. They die what I would call equivalent to an emotional cancer or an emotional stroke or an emotional heart attack. And it even, you see that in the dynamics of different suicides. Like sometimes you get somebody, they have a long history of clinical depression, they're spinning, and by the time it happens, their family realizes that was bound to happen. So like somebody dying of terminal cancer. Sometimes somebody just snaps, and the family's just totally taken aback. And I've seen both, and so that's like an emotional stroke. It's like an emotional heart attack.
Yes.
But it's an illness. And so the book I wrote on suicide, I call it Bruised and Wounded. They're too bruised and wounded to remain alive, which is very different than a Hitler who's too arrogant to remain alive.
Yes.
See, that's the first misconception. The other one, and I'm sure you need to take that to people in constellations, and that is they need to stop second guessing themselves.
Yes.
Like if only I had responded, if only I had seen it, if only I had been there, if only, remember this, all this second guessing and one of the anatomy of suicide oftentimes is you're not there precisely because they picked the time when you're not there.
Mm-hmm.
When you read, people who have done suicide attempts and then weren't successful, and they'll tell you it's like a sickness, and it's precisely everything is that the person isn't there. There's I have a whole library now of books on suicide, and one of them was written by a woman from from Washington called Margaret Atwood. And in fact, she did a video once with the Saddleback Church there.
Rick Warren.
Rick Warren, in fact, we did one with his wife, myself, and Margaret Atwood, but her daughter, Katie, committed suicide. But so Marjorie said, she had some history of clinical depression, but but she says this girl comes home on a Friday night or Friday afternoon from school and lies on bed with her mother and just tells her, like, you and dad really need to go on this retreat and so on. And she managed to get them out of the house. And she killed herself. And Margie said, you're so angry, you could have killed her, like that. But she set the whole thing up that nobody was going to be home. And then the way she did it, it was before her prom. She went out on a Saturday, her parents were gone, and she got her hair done, and she put on her prom dress, took pictures of herself, selfies, and sent them to all her friends, on Facebook and so on, and then killed herself, I can tell you many stories like that. You can't second guess, because that's going to be automatic. I should have seen it. I should have seen it coming. I should have been there. Why didn't I reach out?
So when you were with the Warrens, I've heard their story, Father Ron, and it's similar to what you described, but different, of course. Every situation is unique. But their son Luke had dinner with them, had this wonderful expression of love toward each other, and then he left, and then he committed suicide. So what do you say to those families, Father Ron, besides don't second guess yourself? How do you essentially not do that? How do you forgive yourself for not seeing, hearing, whatever?
Well, no, see, that's what Margaret Atwood means, that things have to be said again and again and again. You can't second guess that, and if you had been alert that evening, he'd have done it the next evening or something. They're going to find a time, like you can't be with somebody 24 hours a day. I'll give you an example. My own brother tells this story. He was driving a school bus. This was like 30 years ago. And the guy, Andrew, who's going to be the suicide, his brother was driving a school bus, and they all three were farming within a little triangle there. So he said, after driving their school bus one morning, they went to Andrew's house, and his brother said, you're dangerously depressed, and we're taking you to a doctor, and they took him to see a doctor. And the doctor actually diagnosed him. He says, you're clinically depressed, and want to hospitalize you. And Andrew said, well, you can't. He said, it's calving time, and I got to be home. And so the doctor gives him some medication, take this medication, and promised me you're going to phone me no matter what time of day it is, and so on. They take him home. He killed himself within an hour. See, so it's not like people aren't there, so I would tell the Warrens or something, well, they know this. It's like the same way as you can be at the bedside of somebody who's dying and you want to save him and you can't. We have to try, but they're going to pick the moment, and it's part of the anatomy of the disease, and that's what's so destructive to, and it can seem so hurtful for people left behind. I have a friend of mine who's a longtime friend. We're high school friends and so on, but his mother committed suicide when he was a young boy, and my friend, he's had some history of clinical depression, and he says the only reason I've never killed myself is that I realized how much hurt that leaves behind. He said it's just that. It's really a hard thing.
But
we
Father
have
Ron,
to keep saying that. Don't second guess yourself. There's nothing you can do.
but and I totally agree with you. And like you said, even in this moment, you had to say it again to me.
Yeah.
Because I go back to when my father-in-law committed suicide, and we played the coulda, woulda, shoulda game, and it gets you nowhere, right?
Yeah.
But the most helpful thing that happened to us, Father Ron, is the Protestant clergy gathered, and they were just not very helpful, to be honest.
Yeah.
The most helpful person was the Roman Catholic priest, my good friend. Yeah. And he walked into the room, and he took the family off to the side, And he said, this is not your fault.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the surprise. Let me give you another one. I had a cousin, Gerard. Him and I went to high school together and so on. He was a married man. Son was already, in college. And these were his hobbies. First of all, he owned a sheet metal company. He was doing very well financially.
Mm-hmm.
He would fix up racing cars and do the stock racing thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he played in a rock band.
Mm-hmm.
So one Sunday night, he's in bed with his wife, and he told his wife, I don't think the furnace is working well. I'm going to go and check it out. She fell asleep. He wasn't there. About an hour or two later, she went down. He was hanging in the basement. That's not her fault. It's nobody's fault,
Right.
Sadly, though, in that history, he was the fourth person, or he was the third. So one of his brothers has done it since. There's something, there's also biochemical stuff that plays into that, and genetics.
Yes. So, Father Ron, do you believe suicide is contagious? In the sense that when there's one, there tends to be more.
I think with younger people, that can be,
Mm-hmm.
like that. And psychologists will tell you, at high schools, and
Mm-hmm.
I find that it's more dangerous for younger kids. And the reason being, because I don't think they have a sense of the finality of death.
Mm-hmm.
One of their friends dies, there's a big funeral and lots of tears, and say, well, God, I could try that too. They don't realize you're not coming back a week later. See, I think with some of them, they don't sense the finality of this, but I think the older people get, the less it's contagious. I think there can be genetic predisposition, like for instance, my cousin's family, they're a wonderful Christian family. 4 of the kids have killed themselves, all in a very different way, but still that's there's a gene there,
Yes. And see, Father Ron, that's where in your article, I don't remember which one it is, where you're talking about emotional cancer.
Yeah.
I have found that description is so helpful to people.
Yeah.
Because just like physical cancer has a genetic component, emotional cancer can as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And we see that evidenced throughout various people's lives. So, Father Ron, I want to move on to another question, if I may.
Okay.
Theologically, historically, we ascribe people who committed suicide to hell.
Yeah.
And
we all did. Nobody had we all did. No denomination had a monopoly.
Oh, that's right. Yes, we all did. And so then you come on the scene and you're proclaiming a message that is more graceful, that is more understanding of our humanity. And what was the price that you paid for that?
Well, first of all, let me say this. It's not just more humanity. It's also, it does a certain fairness to God. Let's start with God.
Okay.
As I said before, most suicides, for instance, the people I've known who have died by suicide. Today we're not supposed to use the word committed suicide anymore.
Right.
I keep slipping. Who died by suicide. In every case, the ones I've known, they've been very sensitive, gentle people.
Mm-hmm.
See, God is for the poor. God is for the weak. God is not going to take somebody who's too bruised and sensitive, and who's ill and put them in hell. I mean, what kind of God would do that?
Right.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I use an analogy, and in the Christian creed, we have a piece in the creed that we say, I don't think we ever think what it means, and it's the most consoling doctrine in all of religion.
Yes.
And we say, when Jesus died, he descended into hell.
Yes.
You say that in your creed as well?
Well, we've tamed it to descended to the dead.
Yeah, we tamed it, then we moved it back, but literally he descended into hell. I want to say that's the most consoling doctrine in Christianity. So let me give you how I explain that. I always tell people, I want to give you 3 pictures, and I want you to melt them into one. And the first one is precisely of a suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So the example I use, a true one. I knew a family back home when I was living in Edmonton. Their daughter was 22, away at college, a long history of clinical depression, emotional cancer.
Mm-hmm.
She tried suicide. They brought her home for 3 months. They took her to psychiatrists, to doctors. They tried to love her. They couldn't break through. She killed herself. Now, second frame. If you're ever in the Anglican Cathedral in London, England, St. Paul's,
Mm-hmm.
there's a very famous painting there by a man called Holman Hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the famous painting of the Christ who knocks.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of knockoff versions of that. But anyway, it's quite a painting. He's got a man behind the door, kind of darkened, and he's huddled. Obviously he's not happy that day. And there's a thick oak door. The door is, it makes sense. Artists do this well. And Jesus is standing with a lantern on the outside, and he's knocking on the door gently, but there's only a doorknob on the inside. See, and the painting is saying, like, Jesus is there,
Mm-hmm.
but you got to open the door.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's something wrong with that image. And it's corrected by John chapter 20, and it happens twice. The first two resurrection appearances to all the disciples in John's gospel. I mean, the first one is to Mary Magdalene, but to the whole community. John emphasized they were in a room huddled in fear with the door locked. They said Jesus came right through the locked door. Notice there wasn't any knocking. He went through the locked door, stood in the middle, and he breathed out, peace be with you.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that you can be sure that 22-year-old girl, sensitive young woman, ill, when she woke up on the other side, Jesus was inside, breathing out peace. He wasn't saying, you got to open it up. You got to open it up. See, and incidentally, that's where we're different from other religions. I've studied world religions. There's a lot of good there, but see, like you take Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, they're not religions of grace.
Right.
They're religions of self-effort. You got to get it right. And if you don't get it right, you're going to come back and do your life over. Or, see, and as Christians, that the power of grace, you don't have to get it right. When we can't help ourselves, God can help us.
Yes.
And this is the extreme example, when we are locked in some kind of private hell into which nothing can penetrate anymore. Medicine, psychiatry, human love, Christ can penetrate there.
Yes.
That's the kind of love that Jesus showed in his death. So it's a love that there isn't a hell that Jesus can't go into, and that's deeply consoling because, it isn't just suicide. People die in anger and bitterness and alienation and so on. If it wasn't for that, there aren't going to be a lot of people in heaven, or if they're in heaven, they're not going to get along very well with each other.
That's that C.S. Lewis comment that some people will be in heaven and they just won't be able to stand it.
Yeah.
There's too much grace and love and peace.
I was on a panel recently. I heard a great line from she's a Black theologian, Gloria Purvis, and she says, I really try to be nice to people, said, realizing I'm probably have to spend eternity with them, which is
right.
A wonderful challenge.
Yes. So Father Ron, I want to come back to that question I asked you. And because you are so close to this whole issue of suicide in your writing, in your thinking, in your pastoral work, etc., did anybody come after you and say, Father Ron, you are preaching heresy?
It's interesting. That hasn't happened.
Praise God. I'm thankful.
But what has happened, not often, once or twice, where people got after me. It wasn't so much, fundamentals to say that you can't preach that. I've had flack or push where people say, by removing that stigma, you're giving people permission to commit suicide. Yes. And that one I had to, that's rattled me a couple of times where people say, that stigma has to stay. They said, one man said, my wife is suicidal. After she read you, said, well, I can kill myself. I want to go to heaven, And since that was probably true, that one shook me up. But others have come, fundamentalists have come after me more in terms of you're giving people permission. Mm-hmm. And that taboo has to stay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I've got pushback.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Father Ron, because I've had the same experience.
Yeah.
And in two instances, I no more got out of the sanctuary, and they were right on my tail.
Yeah.
And confronted me.
Yeah.
You gave people permission.
Yeah.
To end their life. So, Father Ron, I want you to respond, please, to this statement that I did hear at a funeral where a woman had died very tragically. And we don't really know how she died, but it was pretty obvious to the family that somehow she ended her life. So her brother, who's an ordained minister in the denomination of which I'm a part, the United Methodist Church, he stood before the gathered community and he said, and I quote, "My sister did not take her life. My sister ended her pain." In the next sentence, he said, "Here's why I tell you that she did not take her life, because her life is not hers to take. It's God's." How would you respond to that comment? What do you think about what he said?
No, I can go along completely with that. I'll tell you what. In fact, one of the analogies I use, okay, I said, my sister didn't end her life. She entered her pain. Here's an analogy you can use. You know, when the Twin Towers were hit on 9/11, there were people who jumped to their deaths.
Yes.
You know, rather than be burnt to death.
Right.
You know, that's the analogy that fits there. You know, they were burning, and so they jumped to their deaths as a relief from that. You know, that's the way I hear him saying, "My sister didn't take her life; she ended her pain. She jumped from the Twin Towers. Her clothing was on fire." You know, you know, the second part. Give me that second part again. He said,
"You can't take your own life because your life is God's.
Yeah.
And God will hold her in the palm of his hand forever."
Yeah, I agree. No, see, I wouldn't have any trouble with that. You know, you know, it's the same as my dad died of cancer. He was helpless to stop that.
Mm-hmm.
The people I've known who've died of suicide, in a certain sense, they were a little helpless. It's interesting. You've probably had this experience too, where a family tells you, where they had the long emotional cancer thing. They said when the phone call came, the police didn't have to finish the conversation. Something terrible happened. They say they know it's just sooner or later they were going to get that phone call. You know, and so that they realized this is terminal. You know.
So, Father Ron, the next time you write an article on suicide, what are you going to say?
Well, you know, I always work around 4 major points, you know, and we've covered 3 of them.
Okay.
You know, always the thing that it's exactly what you've done. She didn't take her life, you know, she stopped her pain. And also it's they die against their will. They die against their will. Secondly, that not to second guess. You can't take any blame. And the third thing we talked about, their eternal salvation. But the fourth thing that we need to teach, and that is, and I got this from a wonderful book from a woman called Nancy Rappaport, who's actually a psychiatrist at Harvard, and her mother died by suicide. And she's Jewish, but she sent me a note. She says, our rabbi gave me your article, said, because there was nothing. But she wrote a book on her mother called In My Mother's Wake. And she had the idea that said, we have to, if you lose a family member or a loved one, you have to redeem their memory. So that otherwise their whole life is always seen through that prism. You know, their pictures come down, you don't talk about them, you know, they're kind of, today it's they get canceled, you know. And she said, so she wrote this book, said, my mother was a wonderful, wonderful woman, and she had all this life, and I don't want her forever understood through the prism of her death, which was suicide, you know. And that's so true. I'll give you an example here. We had in the city a wonderful priest, an Hispanic priest, Virgil Alessandro, who was famous. He was the first Hispanic Roman Catholic, you know, major theologian we had in this country, you know. and he got honorary degrees from all over. He wrote these books, and he ended up suicide, and I went to his funeral. It was sad because it was kind of hushed, like, there was understanding, God is good, and, but I thought, had this man died of a heart attack or cancer, there'd have been this huge celebration of his life. This was a great man. But the fact that he died by suicide, it's like today what we call cancel culture,
Yes.
And that's Nancy Rappaport, is that I learned that from her. And I tell people, you got to redeem this person's memory, so that you don't forever think of them through the prism of their death. They died by suicide, so the rest of their life is erased. And I like the way Nancy put that. She says, my mother was a wonderful, wonderful woman. I don't want her forever understood through the prism of her death.
That's really powerful.
Yeah.
So, Father Ron, as we close today, I want to again say thank you for your ministry and your work. And now you are teaching full-time again, right?
Yeah.
You are no longer the president of the Oblate Seminary there, or School of Theology, in San Antonio. And so what are you teaching now?
I teach two basic areas. I at the MA level, I teach courses on Christian mysticism. But at the PhD level, I'm doing a lot of directing of theses and so on, including a good number of Methodists who are here.
Okay.
In our doctoral program, we have a good number of Methodists here and so on. But there I teach a course in contemporary spirituality, where we look at different schools of thought, everything from, social justice spirituality, creation-centered spirituality, feminism, different schools of spirituality, and so on.
Yeah.
In fact, I was highly flattered the other day where one of the local Methodist pastors, a woman, told me that when she did her theology in Chicago, said they used the Holy Longing as a textbook in their,
Of course. I'm telling you, amongst Methodists, you're a saint. You don't even have to be canonized. You're already there.
Well, I may just switch denominations here,
So seriously, we value your work, Father Ron.
Yep.
And I do have one other quick thing, though, I want to get from you before we close, if I may.
Okay.
And that is that this is obviously a heavy topic, and I so appreciate the fact that you can, at the appropriate times, bring in some levity just to make it a little more bearable. But one of the things that struck me in one of your articles is that you talked about how people that are deeply wounded, bruised, tend to be really, really sensitive people.
Yeah.
And in one of your articles, you talked about Therese of Lisieux.
Yeah.
And do you mind making that connection for us in terms of the story of a soul and how she speaks of being hypersensitive? How do we deal with that issue? Because there are those for whom that is a tendency.
Yeah, and usually there's a reason, like with Therese, she lost two different mothers, and she almost died of clinical depression twice at age 9 and at age 11, which then of course made her a deep person. She kind of became the Anne Frank of the spiritual life, but and she was lucky. She was able to, take this to God and to religion and to mysticism and a religious community. A lot of people don't have that kind of stuff. And so that people who are oversensitive oftentimes have been wounded,
Yes.
So sometimes they're born with some people are born with a robust psyche. Some people are more fragile, or some people are born with what they call an old soul.
Yeah.
That's really true. So some people are born sensitive, but usually the type of sensitivity that can put somebody over the edge usually has some tragedy in life, usually, especially in young life and so on, where, dare I say, this is not a happy thing to say, but a lot of times with teenage suicides and so on, sexual abuse as a child is what ultimately fractured their psyche, but it can be death,
Mhm.
disappearance of parents, some kind of whatever kind of being orphaned and so on,
Mhm.
especially to somebody who's already naturally fragile and sensitive.
So you put something in the article that I have used a lot. And I think it's a good way for us to end this, because the reality is there are so many people that are hurting so deeply about so many different things. And you put as a reflection on Teresa's life, if you have tender skin, you will end up with a tough, hard heart. If you have tough skin, you can preserve your tender, appropriately sensitive heart. Do you remember saying that?
No, I would have to unpackage that. No,
And-
I think contextually, it's, we try to protect the tender heart with hard skin,
Yes,
um, and that's why we don't like making ourselves vulnerable,
right.
But I'm not sure it works the other way around, that if you have a hard heart, you have a tender skin. So I would have to see the context of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the point is that you make it, that I thought, is that the human soul is longing for divine connection,
Yeah.
right? And
Oh, yeah.
we're going to find it one way or another in this
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
or the next.
Yeah.
Would
Yeah.
you agree?
Oh, absolutely. The guiding religious thing, psychological thing in my life is still Augustine's famous line: "You've made it for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless till they rest in you." So basically, in this life, that is the driving force inside of everybody, whether they admit it or whatever we chase. I forget who was the theologian who said, a man who's lonely seeks out a prostitute, he's actually seeking out God.
Yes.
I
Yes.
just so everything we do, there's only one ultimate motivation and drive and fire inside of us. That notice in how many of my books have the word fire, sacred
Yes.
fire,
Yes.
all kinds of fire. That's the fire I'm talking about.
Well, the founder of Methodism, his famous line was, "Oh God, set me on fire for love of you."
Yeah.
The person who's fully alive
Yeah.
is passionate.
Yeah.
And so, Father Ron, thank you again. And I am so honored and privileged that you would take the time to share today.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for reading my books and using them and so on. That affirms me. When you write, you're really putting notes into milk bottles and hope someone's going to find the milk bottle, pick it up and read the notes. So,
Well, be assured that we have screens in our sanctuary for my sermons, and your picture has been up there so many times. I could put your picture up and say, "Who is that?" And the congregation would say, "That's Father Ron."
and if I'd have known we were doing Zoom today, I would have dressed a little less casually, but so.
You know what? You look great. And thank you again. God bless you now.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye then.